How does one follow a masterpiece like Wrath of Khan? And by all accounts of any sort of consensus, Wrath of Khan remains the best of the Trek films. I don't think you can argue any of the others can measure up to it. There's some good ones. There's some ones with fond memories for, but Wrath of Khan just every time beats them all. And it's probably more than likely will remain that way, barring any other film. And in current era, as I'm taping this, I'm very dubious if any new Star Trek film would come anywhere near it. But Wrath of Khan had some consequences to it. Most notably, big of all, was the death of Mr. Spock. So, of course, they want their film franchise. What are you going to do? You don't have Spock. Could they have carried on? I suppose. You know, it's interesting. The DC Comics had the license for Star Trek at the time. And Marvel had one from the motion picture for a little while. And then it lapsed or what have you. But it was DC Comics who picked it up after Wrath of Khan. And so the series picks up with no Spock, and so Savick was in his place, and they continued on. And you can imagine if there had been a TV series instead of a film series, something like that probably would have happened. And then eventually you get Spock back. It's sci-fi shenanigans, so hey, why not think it's possible? And it was interesting. They must have had some input from, the studio or whatever, telling them this is where it's going. So the way the comic book narrative works, they weaved it in as if this stuff really did happen in between Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock, which, of course, was Star Trek 3. And, well, it was no mystery as to how to find Spock. We know they left him on planet Genesis. And Genesis is the connective tissue of these films, where you have this sort of trilogy. I guess you could call it the Genesis trilogy. You're introduced to it in Wrath of Khan. Then there's another, the consequences of the Genesis project rolling out throughout this film. And then finally Star Trek 4 delivers the consequences for Kirk and crew based on their actions here. And then that's it. But so, of course, at the end, inadvertently due to Khan's, contingency to not only kill himself, but to kill Kirk in the process, detonated the Genesis device in the Matura Nebula. And I guess because of the matter available within the nebula, it created a whole planet out of nothing. And so there they were. And, of course, due to Spock's sacrifice, they were able to warp out in time before blowing up alongside Khan. And then the sad ending with Spock. And that is one of the reasons why most of the time, either Star Trek 3 just gets passed over, or it's deemed as not one of the better films in the series, primarily because it's burdened with you got to bring Spock back. You just had this powerful death scene, all the emotion and everything, and this continues throughout stories and whatnot. Certainly happens in comic books, where you have a character who's killed off, and then later on they bring them back, diminishing the significance of the death and all that stuff, and then it becomes a cheap thing for characters to be killed off when you realize they're going to come back in some form or fashion. And it's just like, well, you just got the cheap emotional response there, and you tear it all down. But back then, this wasn't happening all the time. I mean, soap operas do it, oh, that was actually my twin brother no one knew about, or something like that, or I faked my death and that sort of thing. But here he was very clearly dead, but it fits in with what they had already established and how much they thought ahead of time of whatnot. Of course, they knew they were going to have to bring Spock back for a continuation of this. And so they did. Now, they toyed around. I remember seeing an interview with Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner, And then Shatner suggested, they were saying, we don't know how Spock's coming back, right? It's in the title and all this stuff. And they were like, yeah, we're not spoiling anything. And then Shatner, we don't know. Maybe he'll come. And then I think Leonard Nimoy said, we don't know what he'll come back as. And Shatner said, maybe a pretty girl. That's probably what they would do today. Yeah. But anyway, no. So within the concepts of the Genesis Project and all that, it actually fits very well with what happened to him. So if you haven't seen it already, yes, Spock does come back as he is regenerated by the Genesis wave. So there you have a continuation of Starfleet and Federation politics, and with the Klingons discovering this and seeing it as a threat, which they would, because if you had this Genesis device and you could go to an enemy planet, rather they were talking about going to barren planets and creating a new paradise on it and all that, but if you just went to an enemy's planet and hit it with a Genesis torpedo, the enemy, the people, all their civilization is wiped out, and you got a brand new lush green planet just ripe for colonization. So of course the Klingons, holy crap, they're going to use this on us. However, Commander Cruise, played by Christopher Lloyd in this one, is going rogue here. He doesn't really seek permission from the Empire, as he makes mention that there's some talk within them that they're going to try to make peace with the Federation, that there's more of a move towards that, at least to buy time. And later on, I don't think that was completely mapped out yet, but later on, that's kind of where they go within the film series, and matches up with the situation of Next Generation and all that. So it's interesting how that plays out in certain pointers that you can even go to in a movie that may not have thought it ahead of time, but it worked out. That's how it progressed. So Cruise wants it. He gets it. The guys stole the plans and get disintegrated for their trouble along with his girlfriend. Well, that's romantic. And off he goes to the Genesis planet to see what's what. And there's a science ship sent there, and that's where David and Saavik. And the interesting thing, again, had there been a TV series, is that I think David would have had a much longer life. And pairing up with Saavik is an interesting thing. It's Kirk's son and Spock's protege and all of that. Maybe there would have been a romance or something like that. But unfortunately, no. And then there's a moment of truth for David himself, and that it's revealed that he, like his father, cheated in order to achieve success with the Genesis device, using a form of matter called proto-matter. Even in the terminology, you begin to guess. I guess I could have pseudo matter or whatever, but that it was an unstable form, and that it unforeseen problems. So initially, you've got this perfectly beautiful planet, but then it begins to age rapidly and disintegrate. So the same thing is happening to Spock. They find him; he's a child, and then he keeps rapidly aging. But his mind's completely empty because he's just been regenerated. So the idea, had the mind meld with McCoy hadn't happened. And that's the other big plot point here, because he mind melds with McCoy at the end of the last movie, and now you know why. All of Spock's memories and everything that he was, his soul, his spirit, whatever, is in McCoy. And so that's what's available to reunite it with the body that the Vulcans do at the end and all of that. Otherwise, you would just have this guy who looks like Spock, but he'd be a different person because, his life experience and everything would be very different. The only real flaw in this is that I'm not entirely certain, unless it's just they remove Spock from the atmosphere of the Genesis wave that's ongoing within the planet itself. But Saavik says you got to get Spock off the planet at the end, and they do. Otherwise, he would just keep aging and die. But why? The Genesis wave regenerated him, so it seems like it would have continued anyway. But I don't know. They just figured it would work, and well, it did. you know? So, but I like the film. I think it's a great sequel to Wrath of Khan. It's not as good as Wrath of Khan. It can't reach it, but it has great moments in it. There's exciting things within it. They have to steal the Enterprise, and they go through all of that sort of thing. And the Enterprise is done. They're going to scrap it. And it plays more into that, Kirk's more or less over his feeling sorry for himself for getting old. But it still kind of nags at him here. They say, you're going to trash my ship for getting old. And they see the new ship coming with Excelsior and all that. And then one of the more powerful scenes is the scene between him and Sarek, where Sarek just assumed that Kirk would be the one that Spock would pass his Katra to. That they introduced this idea of his consciousness, he could transmit it to someone else. And if he knows he's dying, he can do that so that it can be deposited in the Great Hall at on Vulcan, where I guess their spirits live forever. It's a haunted hall of Vulcans in there. I don't know. It would be interesting to delve more into that later on. But anyway, that's what was supposed to happen. But and Kirk doesn't understand what he's talking about. And they do this mind meld, and Kirk's forced to relive the death of Spock. And it's quite touching. It's very powerfully done. And it's interesting about the growth of Sarek, where he's almost on the verge of emotion, and he's admitting it to the other Vulcans. He says, my logic falters where my son is concerned. And that's the full completion of that story of the father and son, that they had those conflicts in the show and stuff. And now later, he's grown to understand it. And plus he's witnessing just how great Spock's friends are and what they've done. And he's so, impressed and taken aback. He says, you've lost your son, your ship, and Kirk, I had to do it. So Spock chose well for his friends and other family, if you will, because they risked everything just for him. And it's all, it's not without its consequences. You had in the first movie how Kirk operates. He's always going to find a way to win. And a lot of times he cheats, and so that's what he was doing. But then there was a consequence. Spock died. Here, his son dies. And, there again, devastated Kirk and everything he's going through with all of that. Even though this spawns yet another cheat movement Kirk does, where he cheats Scrooge, outfoxes him, and destroys the ship with the destruct code that we knew from the TV series. But here, there's no last-minute switch or cutoff. It's the full thing, and that's the end of the Enterprise. It crashes into the planet Genesis, and even though they get a new one later, the Enterprise that you grew up with, that's how it came to an end. It's over. And besides, the Federation was going to scrap it anyway, so what are you going to do? But it's really sad, and Kirk, of course, who did Kirk love the most? It was that ship. So, it was a hard choice for him. And so it's, you get tear jerked just for the ship, and so all of that. And then, of course, the fight with him and Scrooge and all that. And I have had enough of you. It's pretty good. Unfortunately, Kirk managed to remember the Klingon terminology for beam me up, and manages to outfox the only remaining Klingon, and they steal the bird of prey, which becomes their vessel for the next film. So, and of course, Genesis dies and explodes, and that's it. And Kirk says his goodbye to David. And so it's it's a lot of adventure and excitement. There's a lot of emotion that I think is well performed. And especially then there's McCoy coming to terms with, his feelings for Spock, and he's like, talking to Spock's empty-headed body. Help me, but ultimately he comes to the, I think the worst part of this is, I don't want to lose you again. So, stuff like that, and it connects with the overall love people had with the characters that had developed over the series and everything, of course. And then you go into the Vulcan mysticism about, we're gonna pull Spock's mind out of McCoy and put it in his regenerated body, and all that. But at least they said it that we don't know
how Spock will be. Will he come back to the way he was? They weren't certain, but in some form or fashion, he's back. And then they do the scene where Spock begins to recognize these people, and he remembers his final conversation with Kirk, and so there you are. He's back. He's not completely back because we see that progress in the next film, but so that was good on them to handle that it wasn't exactly perfect immediately, but you get there. So all in all, other than that, how does he stop aging after leaving the planet? Well, just go with it, I guess. It seems like there would have been some little bit of dialogue to explain why. I guess you just have to go with the Genesis wave wasn't as powerful outside of the planet. I don't know. But that it's fine. It's just that idea that you've killed off a beloved character and then you bring him back. And I think that's probably one of the things that somewhat maybe mars the film, and it's not always counted as the best. Usually there's a Wrath of Khan is the absolute best. Voyage Home is the most fun, and Undiscovered Country is just a good send-off for them. And that's usually kind of the rule of it, whereas Star Trek 3 just kind of gets overlooked, even though it's not bad, but it's not one of the good ones, but I think it is. It's not on par with Wrath of Khan, obviously. None of them are. But still, it's pretty good. And sadly, it's the end of James Horner scoring the film. His music for Star Trek is absolutely beautiful. Of course, he's repetitive. You hear similar themes in Aliens and stuff like that. But a lot of times that has to do with scheduling. You had to hurry up and whip out a soundtrack for the other and this and that. The same thing happened to Jerry Goldsmith with Motion Picture. He had to hurry up and slap that together. It would have been cool if between the two, James Horner did too, so Jerry Goldsmith comes back. He did come back to do Star Trek 5, but yeah. At least it had good music. That might have been a cool thing if they could have done that, but I really wish for these three, because Star Trek 4, I really wish James Horner could have done that one. That would have been his send-off with it. But both men did these nautical themes for the movies, and it just performed so well. So I was sad to see that's it, but it's very good music. And there's later on there was like an extended soundtrack album release, which has even more of the music that was in it, and it's pretty good. And he does his own Klingon theme, which is a little different from Jerry Goldsmith, but it kind of has some of the same ideas and stuff like that. So Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock is beloved in my mind, and I think of it fondly, and I don't think it gets a fair shake more times than not. So anyway, there you go. Spock is back, and all's well for now. We'll get to the next film for Kirk and crew.